Hello Internet, and welcome to the PDH portal where I discuss different PDH deck techs. Artifacts may be one of the most broken mechanics and types in Magic itself. It is not uncommon to see artifact affinity be something that causes bans and people to find ways to break what seemingly seem like straightforward artifacts. We can do the same thing in Pauper Commander using Esperzoa. I call it Ancient Artifact Jellyfish. Esperzoa is a 4/3 flyer for 2 and a blue that reads, at the beginning of your upkeep, return an artifact you control to its owner's hand. We get a repeatable way to get artifacts back into our hand so we can replay them. It's not quite recursion by itself, but it does give us a clear roadmap of what we want to do. Replay artifacts that give us a constant stream of value. Since PDH is a legacy format, we get the entire history of Magic cards to see what we can take advantage of. I'm sure there's no way to abuse this, right? Right? Esperzoa allows us to return things to our hand and replay them. What we want to do is find a good crop of cards that have a nice enter the battlefield effect that are good to repeat. Card draw, life gain, and removal are all great things for us to do in the game without specifically worrying about drawing into different blue cards. One of the main ways a deck runs out of gas is simply running out of cards in hand. We want to keep our hand full of cards each turn, so the first thing we want to do is repeatably draw 2 cards per turn. Turns out there are plenty of cheap draw a card ETB effects with artifacts. Alchemist Vial is an example. It's a 2-drop that lets you draw a card when it enters, with the added benefit of we could sacrifice it to stop an opponent's creature from blocking us. This is a cheap way to pay 2 around for a second card, and with all of the card draw we should be able to start hitting our land drops pretty reliably. Being able to know what card is coming is also strong. Lembas is another 2-drop that allows us to scry for 1 before drawing, so we can bottom deck cards that we don't think that will be useful. It is the same cost as Alchemist Vial, and if we sacrifice it for life, it goes back into our library. Ichor Wellspring is a staple in many formats for drawing cards, but for Esperzoa we'll only be focusing on its ETB effect for drawing a card. Esperzoa does not allow us to take advantage of die-type triggers, like when Ichor Wellspring goes to the graveyard. Esperzoa returns the cards to hand, not to the graveyard. The ETB is still a nice effect, and the death trigger is nice if people blow stuff up. We just can't repeat it. Now, Cryogen Relic is a new card from Edge of Eternities that lets us draw a card when it enters and when it leaves. A lot of cards will just say when it enters the battlefield, and that's an important distinction. Esperzoa is not sacrificing and returning or exiling the cards it returns. Cryogen Relic allows us to take advantage of both the ETB and the return effect of Esperzoa. If we can get this onto the board, it's a potential 3 cards per turn. Close to this is Clockwork Fox, a 3/2 Fox for 3 generic mana, which gives us 2 cards when it leaves the battlefield. Worst case it dies and we get the card draw, and best case we flicker it back later. It does give your opponents a card draw as well, but sometimes it pays to be nice. Politicking to leave your commander alone to let people draw a card can be a good bargaining chip. Now, if you think you're good on card draw, I've added some cards like Prize Statue or Gold Pan that can give you a treasure when it enters. Gold Pan is technically an equipment, but you could use it as a replay artifact without attaching, or attach it to a creature to give them a +1/+1 bonus. If you're really sneaky, you can attach it to the creature, swing for the extra +1/+1, then return it at the beginning of the next upkeep. Now, if you don't want treasure or card draw, Peace Strider can give you 3 life for basically 4 mana, and it's a nice 3/3 blocker. Pendulum of Patterns will give you 3 life for 2 mana, and you can sack it for a card if you want to pay the extra 5 mana. Now, we are in blue, so our creature removal is a bit limited. The next best thing is getting things out of the way, so we have a bunch of things to tap things down that we think might be an issue. Mechanizoa is a 5/5 artifact creature for 4 and 2 blue, which in itself is pretty beefy. But when it enters, it taps down a target artifact creature and gives it a stun counter. While the initial mana cost is high, it is part of the Edge of Eternity set that does include a warp cost for 2 and a blue. We can cast it out once for the cheaper warp cost, then cast it later from exile for the full cost. Then if we really need it later in the game, we can bounce it back with Esperzoa to then replay the warp cost. Not really broken at all. Chrome Prowler can also tap things down at instant speed, which will allow you to get a blocker on board for 2 and a blue, or play it just as someone goes to combat to tap something down and give you a blocker just in case. Then you can pop it back to your hand to do it all again later. Gilded Scuttler is a weaker version without flash, but it does give us a 1/3 crab for 2 and a blue to do some decent blocking in and of itself. Tumble Magnet also lets us tap down creatures, but it requires a charge counter to do so. So what happens when it runs out of charge counters? It becomes an excellent choice for Esperzoa to return to your hand and recast it, giving it back all of its counters. Now, if we need to take something out of someone's graveyard, Crossroads Candle Guide lets us exile up to 1 target card from a graveyard. Since it's an artifact creature, we can bounce it back with Esperzoa if we need to, and if we leave it on the board, it's going to act like a mana rock. Bouncing artifacts themselves to get their ETBs is nice, but we can also take advantage of when things enter the battlefield. Rook Turret is 3 and a blue for a flying artifact that reads, whenever another artifact you control enters, you may draw a card. This is a good way to start focusing on non-card draw artifacts to replay, but still get the advantage of the card draw. So, we can do this sort of pseudo-flicker with Prize Statue to get the card draw from Rook Turret and the treasure from Prize Statue. It does require us to pitch a card if we draw one, but then we can at least start to filter out bad draws. Sky Swimmer Koi is a copy of this, except it's a fish. Now this is fine, not everything needs to be an artifact, but we know that we will be having tons of artifacts later, so we can double up on the card draw. Steelfin Whale allows us to untap it when an artifact enters. Since it has affinity for artifacts, the hope is you can get this out early at a reduced cost, swing with it, and then use an artifact returned by Esperzoa to turn around and untap it. Now you have a decent blocker. Weldfast Wingsmith, however, wants you to replay that artifact early to give it flying. I wouldn't recommend having both Weldfast Wingsmith and Steelfin Whale out at the same time, but worst case, Weldfast is a 3/3 on the ground that you can make a flyer when it feels appropriate. Bring the artifact in when you need to fly over an opponent's creatures, or wait to untap the Steelfin Whale when they're open on the ground, and then you get a 3/4 whale through. Eye of Malcator rounds this out, as when another artifact enters, it turns into a 4/4 Phyrexian. This can save it from board wipes, as it isn't a creature when it's not our turn, and when we do recast our artifact, now you have yet another 4/4 to try and smack our opponents with. Gear Seeker Serpent is a 5/6 serpent for 5 and 2 blue, but it has affinity for artifacts. We can very quickly reduce its cost to get a nice big creature out, and we can make it unblockable for 5 and a blue. Illivoy Lightjammer is a nice little protection equipment. For 1 and a blue, you can give something hexproof until end of turn, and since it auto-equips, at enter, it buffs something with +1/+2. Then you can use Esperzoa to return it later. It's not a creature, but the card art does kind of make it look like one. Now, Nimblewright Schematic is a great way to trigger all those when artifacts enter triggers. When it enters, it creates a 1/1 construct artifact creature token. So for 2 mana, you're going to get 2 activations of those abilities for anything that worries about when artifacts enter. 2 mana for a lot of the things we want to replay is really not that bad. Since we should have plenty of card draw, we should be hitting our land drops almost every turn. We are in blue, which doesn't help us ramp much, but we can do the next best thing. Ethereum Sculptor is a Vidalcan Artificer and artifact that reads, artifact spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. A huge amount of cards in the deck are artifacts and have a generic mana for their casting cost, so lowering that cost by 1 gives us more mana to cast more spells. If we can also get Foundry Inspector on the board, which costs 3 generic instead of 1 and a blue like Ethereum Sculptor, we can reduce that cost by 1 again. Now our 2 drops that we're replaying are free, and many of our artifacts are starting to become very cheap. We can also try to have a little bit of fun, and I've included the Urza lands as well. Urza's Mine, Urza's Power Plant, and Urza's Tower are included. By default, they only tap for 1 colorless mana, but if we can get all 3 out, they each tap for 3 colorless mana themselves. It's not often you get all 3 out, but it does feel good when you can. Everflowing Chalice rounds out our mana accelerants. It's a 0-cost artifact that reads, tap and add 1 colorless mana for each charge counter on it. You add charge counters by kicking it for 2 generic mana, as it has multi-kicker. This means that you can kick it 3 times for 6 mana, and you'll get 3 counters. Now it's going to tap for 3 colorless mana each time. Worst case, it's a 2-drop mana rock, so it's not any worse than any of the other mana rocks. But if you can get this out on a good turn to multiple charge counters, you can give yourself plenty of extra mana to play with. The Vidalcan Engineer doesn't reduce our costs, but it does give us 2 mana to spend on artifacts. It itself costs 1 and a blue, so this is where we can get it out early, and it gives us additional mana to get our other artifacts out on the board. Now, Apprentice Wizard, A Venerable Human Wizard for 1 and 2 blue will give us 3 colorless mana for the cost of 1 blue. It's not much, but it is an honest day's work. Mycosynth Wellspring is a nice fallback if you don't have a land in hand, as it's a 2-drop that lets you search for a basic land and put it into your hand. It's not exactly ramp, but it is cheap and it lets you hit your land drops. Since we're in blue, the rest of the deck rounds out with some nice counterspells like Arcane Denial, Disruption Protocol, Override, and Rewind. Some of these will also untap our mana to open it back up, or give us some card draw. Some of the mana rocks like Arcane Signet, Felwar Stone, and Commander Sphere give us some ramp. And yes, before anybody says anything, I know we're in mono blue. The fact they are artifacts is the biggest reason we want to run them. Forge of Heroes is a nice little inclusion to give our commander a +1/+1 counter when we can. A few more generic creatures give us some nice blockers like Silver Raven and Sky Scanner, and Thaumaturge's Familiar. We don't get much value from them, but it is nice to have some cheap creatures that can do some blocking or some flying damage for us. We will honor your sacrifice. Esperzoa has been a fun deck to make and play with so far. Edge of Eternities brought in a few new cards for this deck to take advantage of, and it continues a long tradition in Magic of making artifacts one of the most broken things in the entire game. I hope you enjoyed taking a look at this deck. If you're interested in viewing this deck list in full, I have a link to it on the PDH Portal website in the video description. If you have any interesting ideas for decks, please leave them in the comments, and check out the website at thepdhportal.com. Goodbye, Internet. Hello again, Internet. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please give it a like. And if you have not already, why don't you go ahead and subscribe? The button's right there below the video. It greatly helps the channel, and it lets you know when new videos are posted. Since you're here, why don't you check out another video? One is suggested here for you, so go ahead and click on it. But no matter what you do, thanks for watching. Goodbye, Internet!